This is the Princeton Drawing Study Room at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art. It's mainly a European collection, although it also includes Japanese prints and Indian miniatures, and it includes many of the greatest names of the European art historical tradition. Works of art on paper are sensitive to light, so they can't be put on permanent display. When they aren't on display, they live here and can be consulted in the Princeton Drawing Study Room.
This is one of the oldest drawings in our collection, and it's by Raphael, and it's one of only 2 Raphael drawings in a public collection in Scotland. This composition is called the Madonna of the Fish, and the finished painting is in the Prado in Madrid, but it was created for San Domenichino in Naples. This modello would have been presented to his client to give an idea of what the finished work would look like. The majority of the drawing is done in this ink and wash with white heightening, and you can see these pentimenti lines, which is literally the lines of the artist while he's thinking, as he is playing with the composition and trying to work out exactly where to place the figures. So this sheet is over 500 years old and it's incredibly fragile. There's these fine lines have been done with chalk. There's a gold paint around the border. The fact that it survived is not so surprising as with some of the other works in the collection, because Raphael would always have been avidly collected, and we can see collector's marks stamped onto the paper from previous owners. So following from the Raphael, I'm just going to show you another one of our Renaissance drawings. And this is a real gem of the collection. It's a drawing by Leonardo da Vinci. Again, this is the only public collection in Scotland to have a drawing by this artist. This is absolutely one of the stars of our collection, very precious. It was purchased for the galleries in 1991 with help from the Art Fund and private treaty sale. I'm just going to turn it over to show you how he's used both sides of the sheet. There's another 4 paws on this side. Paper would have been very precious, so Leonardo's making absolutely the most use of his paper he can, repeated studies on both sides of the sheet. It's very popular with visitors, it's so rare. A lot of the Leonardo drawings in the UK are in the Royal Collection, and we're extremely lucky to have this in a public collection. This is a remarkable drawing by an artist called Matthias Bookinger. And he's inscribed it himself, that he drew it in Edinburgh on April the 4th, 1728. And he's described himself as being born without hands or feet. And he's known to have stood at around 2'5" high. The picture, which is drawn in brown ink and pen on vellum, shows a fanciful altarpiece with the saints depicted as statues across the top, all these architectural features. The entire Lord's Prayer written on the left here, the 10 Commandments and the Creed there. One of his specialties was micrography, which is an ancient art of writing in very small letters, sometimes using the lines of your writing to create forms and shapes. So we've just looked at the Leonardo drawing, which was created as a study of the natural world and an analytical drawing. And what we've got here is some examples of artists drawing as part of their process for a painted work. This is a red chalk drawing by Guthrie, and it's for the large painting which we have in the gallery of Erminia finding the wounded Tancred. It's a poem based on the Crusades, and Erminia comes across her lover Tancred, who's been mortally wounded. As you can see in the drawing, Guthrie really concentrating on this figure's movement as she sort of darts forward in panic at the sight of her lover. In the finished painting, it feels a lot more static, but with the sort of soft medium of red chalk, the lines are far more fluid, and you get this real sense of her sort of desperation. This is a fantastic drawing by Seurat. It's a study for his picture of bathers on the banks of the Seine, which is in the National Gallery in London. He's known to have created individual studies for all of the 4 main figures in this painting, including 13 oil sketches and a number of drawings as well. And this drawing is for one of the central figures. It's a young boy who's sitting on the edge of the riverbank with his feet in the water. So moving on from a very highly finished but preliminary drawing, here we have an example of an artist's sketchbook. And this one is from the Scottish artist William McTaggart, and it's one of 4 that we have in the collection. These sketches really are jottings. Some of them are quite indecipherable to us. They wouldn't have been to him. They show fishermen at work, the coast, boats on the water. McTaggart's primary interest was the landscape, the seascape, and man's relationship with that.
Scottish drawings and watercolours are a great highlight of our collection here. The collection is about 65% Scottish works of art on paper. This watercolour by MacIntosh, the title is The Road Through the Rocks, Port Vange, and it's dated about 1926, 1927. MacIntosh has this incredibly kind of crystalline, clear sense of colour, and you can see that with these pure tonal blues and greens and grey shades of watercolour. But unsurprisingly, as an architect, he also has this remarkable sense of form. You can see the contrast in the organic shapes of the rolling hills and the curves of the road, and in contrast to the sort of serrated forms of the rocks and the kind of jagged intensity of this area in the foreground. He has this kind of extraordinary feeling for the landscape. One artist that we represent well in the print room who thought on paper, who was a very kind of freehand sketcher, was the great 19th century painter David Wilkie, and we have a drawing here. It's just entitled Lady Reading. It's a wonderful, evocative, quick freehand sketch with these very characteristic looping ink lines and this extraordinary tangle of lines that Wilkie produces when he's just quickly sketching. We also have a collection of sketches and quite amusing things related to the Glasgow boys. The Glasgow boys, Edward Arthur Walton, James Guthrie and Joseph Crawhall in particular, were close friends. They went out into the landscape painting together. They were in revolt against the academic conservative traditions of painting and wanted a much more direct engagement with nature. And we have this sketchbook that belonged to James Guthrie, and it's a serious document because it contains studies for paintings, including some paintings that are now, one in particular, in the Orchard, which is now part of the National Gallery of Scotland's collection, jointly owned with Glasgow Museums. And here's a study for the oil painting, which has 2 figures, one of them kneeling down, the other one standing. He's obviously really thought through the composition and perhaps decided he liked the left-hand side, but he wanted to revise the right-hand side. So he just cut his page in half and continued on the next page, working out his composition. So you can see sketchbooks really are a working document, and this is a fascinating way of understanding the evolution of that particular picture. There's also this really beautiful drawing of a girl's head. And here's heads, bodies and legs. You can see it's inscribed in the bottom right-hand corner, Crawhall, Guthrie and E.A. Walton. And this is that game where somebody draws a head, you pass the paper along, you fold it over, and then the next person draws the body. The game of consequences. And here they are playing it all together. We have more finished things by artists associated with the Glasgow boys. In particular, this watercolour and others by Arthur Melville. Melville was very close friends with Guthrie, Walton and Crawhall and the other Glasgow boys, although he never actually lived and worked in Glasgow. Unlike the others, specialised in watercolour rather than oil painting, and he's one of the most innovative and original watercolourists of his age. Melville evolved his own watercolour technique. If you look at the top half of this picture, you can see that the foliage on this city square is just kind of, the paint is just spattered on. Melville painted in blots and spots. It looks very rapid and impressionistic, but in fact it was extremely controlled and meticulously planned. His technique was one of the things that made him famous, because when he first started exhibiting, in the 1880s, it really divided the critics. Some of them thought he was a great innovator, others thought he was slapdash and were horrified by it. Another artist who similarly embraced working in a sort of more fluid wet watercolour technique was Bessie McNichol, a contemporary and friend of the Glasgow boys. And this watercolour of about 1900, very different in feel to Melville. The title is Three Ladies of Fashion, and it looks like two rather elaborately dressed ladies going to try on hats at a milliner's, with another more plainly dressed lady behind, who's perhaps assisting them. But it's a wonderful contrast between the fluid wet watercolour technique, which was becoming fashionable, and you can really see that here with this great slash of green that's perhaps her sash, and this lady's black sash, and then the sort of grey watercolour here to suggest her her sort of voluminous skirts, but then very, very delicate treatment of the faces. And you still have a strong sense of their forms, even in using very light tonal watercolour. She sort of really articulates the feel of those big sleeves and their capes and their drapery.